We're going to look at chapter 26, and as you can tell from the title, this one is liberalism and its challengers. And the time frame that we're looking at is between 1960 and 1973. So the topics covered in this chapter are the politics of liberalism, and then it goes on to the civil rights movement intensifies 1961 to 1968. Then we're going to look at federal efforts towards social reform, kind of backing up a little bit, 1964 to 1968, the Vietnam War from 1961 to 1969, and then challenges to the liberal establishment, because that is the last part of the title, liberalism and its challengers. So let's jump right into it. So we're going to start off talking about Kennedy. And of course, this is President Kennedy, JFK. So capitalism underwent a transformation in the post-war years with the new reform capitalism or democratic capitalism. And what that does is it created abundance for all and benefiting the masses without a government-conducted redistribution of wealth. In 1958, the economist Galbraith argued in The Affluent Society that American progress would result from greater investment in education, in research, and also in development. And these ideas were influential in American politics. And when JFK was elected president in 1960, he offered Americans an image of wealth and economic possibility contained in what we call the nuclear family. Kennedy promised Americans that he would fight tyranny, poverty, disease, and war with his new Frontier program, but his achievements more closely resembled FDR's New Deal, with Congress approving an expansion of unemployment, public housing spending, an increase in Social Security, and the minimum wage. So Kennedy was stronger on foreign policy than domestic change, and he fought the Cold War with fervor, offering the United States as an example to newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and portraying communism as a fundamental barrier to achieving a free world. Kennedy, aware of Eisenhower's plan to use the CIA to overthrow Castro in Cuba, set the plan in motion on April 17, 1961, when an invasion force made up of CIA-trained Cuban exiles landed at the Bay of Pigs. No American troops were present because Kennedy hoped to keep the United States' role in the invasion a secret. Castro's troops, however, were victorious, and in spite of Kennedy's hopes, the invasion did not trigger an uprising against Castro's government and the communist government that had been established in Cuba. 2 months after the Bay of Pigs invasion, Kennedy met with Khrushchev in Vienna, he's the leader of the Soviet Union, where tensions between the superpowers escalated, resulting in increases in defense spending and the number of troops stationed in Europe and in civil defense activities. In August of 1961, the Soviet Union built a wall dividing East Berlin from West Berlin, and for a short time, tensions seemed to be eased. Just to give you an idea of Bay of Pigs and where all that is going on. So this is the U.S.-backed invasion, so you can take those Cuban exiles from Florida, send them back to Central America by way of Guatemala, over Honduras into Nicaragua, and then up to Cuba, where they're going to invade, and it doesn't, as we know, it doesn't go as planned. The exiled Cubans are not able to overthrow the Cuban government and Castro. Though the Bay of Pigs invasion it is a defeat for the Kennedy administration, the United States and the Soviet Union continued to clash over Cuba. And on October 22nd in 1962, Kennedy appeared on television to tell the nation that the Soviets were building missile sites in Cuba. So Kennedy ordered a blockade of the island and pledged that failure to abide by the blockade would result in airstrikes against Cuba. And many feared that the situation would lead to like a nuclear annihilation of the United States. You have to remember Cuba is not very far from Florida. It's not a very far launch pad. It'd be easy to launch a missile and take out our nation's capital from Cuba. So the crisis only eased when Kennedy and the Soviet leader reached a compromise, and Khrushchev took the missiles out of Cuba, and the United States agreed not to attack Cuba, and Kennedy secretly agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey that were aimed at the Soviet Union. So the two leaders, they agreed on further measures to ease tensions, including the 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which allowed underground testing but not above ground testing. And the two leaders also established a hotline to enable quick communications between the United States and the Soviet Union. So that's what's going on internationally. What I want to do now is shift our focus and look at what's going on nationally, what's going on within our nation's borders. And so we're going to look at the civil rights movement and specifically look at some freedom rides. So the civil rights movement gained momentum and won political attention in the 1960s, and the Congress of Racial Equality was at the center of that with the inauguration of freedom rides. This Congress of Racial Equality, it's also called CORE for short, and they determined to test the government's commitment to enforcing a legal decision ordering the desegregation of interstate transit. And so what they're going to do is launch this program in which blacks and whites would travel together through the South. CORE informed the FBI and the Justice Department of the freedom rides, but the riders encountered Klan-led violence in Alabama and were forced to abandon the plan in interest of CORE members' safety. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee took on the freedom rides, arguing that if violence could stop one portion of the movement, it would stop the entire civil rights movement. And when the bus reached Montgomery on May 20th, whites attacked. With violence escalating and the riders determined to continue, the Kennedy administration sent federal marshals and pushed the Alabama government to ensure the safety of civil rights activists in the state. Attorney General Robert Kennedy then pushed the Interstate Commerce Commission to prohibit the segregation of transportation facilities, but many Southerners refused to cooperate, prompting the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee members to push harder to end segregation in many aspects of public life. In 1962, James Meredith attempted to become the first black student to register at the University of Mississippi, but Mississippi segregationist Governor Ross Barnett blocked him, a move that triggered a campus-wide riot in which 2 bystanders were killed. In 1963, the civil rights movement took a center stage in Birmingham, Alabama, with a fight against employment discrimination, segregation, and police brutality fueling activism. In Birmingham, protesters, many of whom were children and some of whom were as young as 6 years old, encountered violence when Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor used police dogs and fire hoses on them and ordered mass arrests. These are children. It says many of the whom they were 18-year-old boys and girls. So technically these are still children. These are children they used police dogs and fire hoses to attack children. So in response to that, Kennedy sent federal negotiators to end the conflict, but in spite of the negotiation success, on September 15, 1963, 4 little girls were killed when the Ku Klux Klan set off dynamite at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy had delivered a nationally televised address on civil rights, arguing that civil rights posed a moral crisis for the nation and suggesting that the United States pass the civil rights legislation to end segregation of public accommodations in schools and ensure that blacks had access to the ballot. Kennedy's speech came in the context of resistance to civil rights. Alabama Governor George Wallace personally blocked the access of 2 black students to the University of Alabama, requiring federal marshals and the Alabama Guard to step in. The same day, Mississippi NAACP leader Evers was gunned down in his driveway. And in spite of all this escalating violence, Congress stalled on passing civil rights legislation. So civil rights leaders organized a march on Washington for jobs and freedoms, with 250,000 protesters assembling in front of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28th of 1963. Speeches ranged from John Lewis's militant criticism of the Kennedy administration to Martin Luther King Jr.'s hopeful "I Have a Dream" speech. Here are some of the women that are marching in Washington. Take note. It's not all black. You'll notice there's 1 white woman, and there's a couple of whites in here also sprinkled throughout, so it's not just a black protest. After Kennedy's death, Kennedy dies in Dallas, and after his death, Johnson made civil rights a priority and triumphed over a Southern filibuster to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended discrimination in public accommodations, facilitated the integration of schools, improved access to the right to vote, and gave the federal government a stronger role in mediating racial conflicts. In spite of this leap forward, though, Johnson made with civil rights, discrimination in voting was a persistent problem in the South. What they're trying to do is just keep blacks from voting and also Hispanics. It's not just that one minority. There's lots of minorities that they're going to try to keep out. They're going to put in literacy tests. They're going to make them pay these extravagant poll taxes, and then also administrative bias to disenfranchise blacks. The civil rights movement responded to the slow pace of change with different groups organizing Freedom Summer in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer Project utilized 800 volunteers, most of whom were white college students from across the country, to register voters and improve education for students in segregated schools. White Southerners violently resisted the Freedom Summer, and in late June of 1964, KKK members murdered 3 civil rights workers. In spite of the capture of the killers, violence continued. Out of the Freedom Summer came the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which functioned as an alternative to Mississippi's all-white state Democratic Party because they didn't allow blacks in. And in August of 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sent a delegation to attend the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, but the delegates were not allowed to be seated. Part of that group included a delegate named Fannie Lou Hamer, a Mississippi plantation worker who had been fired for her voter registration activities. She gave a passionate televised testimony that prompted LBJ to propose a compromise in which the MFDP, the Mississippi delegation, they would receive 2 at-large seats, and members of the regular Mississippi delegation would swear their support for the Democratic presidential ticket. Neither side accepted the compromise, though. But in 1968, an integrated Mississippi delegation attended the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Freedom Summer spread across the South after February of 1965 murder of black activists by state troopers, with Martin Luther King Jr., calling for a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery to press the governor to enforce civil rights. On March 7th, law enforcement officials sprayed marchers with tear gas, beat them, and then turned them back to Selma. And shortly thereafter, a white clergyman who had joined the protesters was murdered by a group of whites on the streets of Selma. The marchers eventually succeeded in reaching Montgomery on March 25th, but afterwards, KKK members murdered a white female marcher from Michigan. The violence of white resistance and the commitment of the marchers pushed Johnson in an address to Congress and the nation to ask for voting rights legislation. In his address, Johnson evoked a civil rights anthem, stating that it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. On August 6 of 1965, Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act, which banned all barriers used to deny blacks access to the franchise, including poll taxes and literacy tests. The legislation also increased federal enforcement and required states with troubled histories to consult with the federal government before changing any voting laws. Even with these victories, the civil rights movement began to fracture. Organizations came to distrust the administration for failing to provide protection for voter registration workers. This is percentage of blacks of voting age, how they registered. So just registering for vote doesn't mean they actually did vote, but you can tell it was on a rise in the 1940s, picked up during the 50s, the civil rights, kind of taking off. And then notice it levels out. But then we have some acts that are going into place, some marches, some civil rights movements happening, and then you'll notice the huge uptick. Not where it needs to be, that you'll notice that huge increase, especially with the passing of the Voting Rights Act. So Martin Luther King, he believed in peaceful protests. You never use violence. You sit back, and if people attack you, that's just what it is, and you learn how to cope with those attacks. Malcolm X, on the other hand, was different, and he was more militant. And these militant individuals and organizations gained popularity in most sectors of the left. And among those, like I said, was Malcolm X, and he offered a new sense of racial consciousness, pride, and religion for African Americans. And while serving time in prison after a misspent youth, Malcolm Little converted to the Nation of Islam, a religious sect based partly on Muslim teachings and partly on the notion that white people were the devils. And after his release, Malcolm changed his last name to the letter X to symbolize the fact that his African ancestry was unknown. Malcolm X encouraged African Americans to embrace self-determination, racial pride, and self-defense, criticizing more mainstream African American leaders for not protecting women and children. Though he eventually gravitated away from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X continued to promote self-determination, and his influence on young black activists was significant. In 1965, he was murdered by members of the Nation of Islam. Blacks who followed Malcolm X's teachings also rejected Dr. King as a leader, because he favored black power, self-defense, and separation from all whites. In 1966, the SNCC followed suit and expelled its white members, embracing the slogan of Black Power. Black power frightened a lot of whites, though, as it emerged. A series of riots began to erupt in black ghettos across the United States, and the riots confused and upset whites who didn't understand the extent of the horrific conditions for blacks in places like Harlem, Rochester, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, places like that around the U.S. The benefits of civil rights legislation had failed to reach black Northerners who were living with racism that existed outside of the legal structure of Jim Crow. Housing conditions were despicable, poverty and unemployment were high, and police disproportionately targeted and brutalized black communities. Whites perceived the ghetto uprisings as examples of bad behavior, but blacks saw them as rebellion signaling police protests and frustration. Johnson's Kerner Commission, which studied the uprisings, declared that white racism was the cause of the unrest, not bad behavior. In 1966, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, college students in Oakland, California, formed the Black Panther Party, which placed the experiences of black Americans in a global context and presented an image of masculine strength and self-determination. The Black Panthers also sought to improve community life in black urban areas by creating daycare centers and healthcare facilities. They also introduced free lunch to some of these places. But the Black Panthers often ended up in violent confrontations and shootouts with the police, and by the early 1970s, violence had really began to unravel the Black Panther Party. So part of, racial justice and racial equality, that was a big part of Johnson's time in office, but also what is known as the Great Society. And on May 22nd, 1964, Johnson spoke to an audience about his hope for achieving this great society through enactment of a series of liberal social programs designed to solve problems of race and poverty by improving conditions in urban areas, the environment, and education. And his administration was able to pass several far-reaching federal laws, including the Elementary and Secondary School Act, which provided federal funds directly to public schools to help improve their quality. The Great Society platform also emphasized the need for environmental protection and succeeded in passing hundreds of laws that targeted air and water pollution, waste disposal, the use of natural resources, and the preservation of wildlife. Johnson attacked poverty by building on a foundation Kennedy had laid before his assassination, the provision of federal aid to impoverished areas. Johnson designed the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 to provide assistance to the poor, which included job training, education, a program called Volunteers in Service to America, and the Community Action Program, which was intended to involve poor people in efforts to improve their communities. Within 5 years, the Johnson administration's program reduced the overall poverty rate from 20 to 13% and pushed the rate of black poverty down from 40 down to 20%. Johnson's war on poverty emphasized economic growth as a path toward a more even distribution of wealth, and Johnson built on the 1962 Revenue Act by cutting taxes across the board. By the end of the decade, the gross national product had increased by nearly $400 billion. Johnson's war on poverty was a key component of his 1964 presidential campaign, and his opponent, Barry Goldwater, represented a new surge of right-wing conservatism, arguing that government was too large and that the Johnson administration was not fighting hard enough in the Cold War. Johnson, however, wins the election. His victory produced significant change, and when the 89th Congress approved his aid to public schools, Medicare, Medicaid, the Voting Rights Act, funding to cities for local improvements, increases in the minimum wage, the creation of the National Endowment for the Fine Arts, National Endowment for Humanities, immigration reform, and environmental improvements, you could see that it was a clear victory in more than just the presidential election. The Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren was also in step with a lot of liberal policies of the Johnson administration, affirming the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act, striking down the poll tax in 1966, and ending restrictions on interracial marriage. The Warren Court also ruled that Southern school districts, which had been dragging their heels on school integration since Brown, could no longer propose desegregation. And his court ruled in Gideon versus Wainwright that states had to provide an attorney to individuals who could not perform one. And in Miranda v. Arizona, the court ruled that police had to inform individuals under arrest of their rights under the Constitution. Other decisions also reflected the new liberal perspective of the court, which in 1962 ruled against prayer in schools. The court also ruled in 1965 that states could not ban the sale of contraceptives, because to do so was an invasion of privacy, and in 1966 it ruled that states could not ban pornographic material. So while all this is going on, we're going to go back to international affairs really quickly and look at intervention in South Vietnam. Kennedy was committed to the theory of containment and believed that if one country in Asia fell to communism, it would produce a domino effect throughout the region. In an effort to contain communism in Vietnam, Kennedy sent financial aid and military to South Vietnamese President Diem. Diem was a wealthy Catholic who had little in common with the largely rural peasant Buddhist people of South Vietnam. He exacerbated tensions in 1963 by banning Buddhists, the country's most popular religion, from holding religious celebrations. And with his popularity deteriorating, the Kennedy administration supported a military coup to replace him in his government. Although the coup was successful in removing Diem, the new military regime proved no more capable of waging an effective war against the National Liberation Front. By late 1963, Kennedy appeared to be torn between escalating American involvement in Vietnam or negotiating a peace. So he's assassinated during that time, and Johnson is now going to have to deal with the escalating problems in Vietnam, but he feared that appearing soft on communism would compromise his ability to pass his sweeping domestic policies. So after deciding that more American troops were needed, Johnson waited for the right opportunity to garner congressional support for increased military action. In August of 1964, Johnson found his moment when North Vietnamese gunboats attacked an American spy ship that was in the Gulf of Tonkin, 60 miles off the North Vietnamese coast. 2 days later, a U.S. destroyer reported coming under attack, but due to bad weather conditions could not verify being fired upon. Although neither ship was damaged, Johnson used this opportunity to urge Congress to authorize military action. Congress agreed and passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson a blank check for making military decisions in Vietnam. After winning the election in '64, Johnson began escalating military actions in Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder began in March of 1965, and over the next 3 years, millions of tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam. Yet this massive show of force did little to advance American efforts in Vietnam, for the largely agricultural nation did not have the type of industrial targets that are best suited for aerial attacks. So what we typically try to do in aerial attacks is you try to take out like hospitals and factories that are building your war supplies and military supplies and shipbuilding areas. Vietnam didn't really have a whole lot of those. And so because it was so rural, not a lot of large cities to take out, and that's what they're saying, like our aerial attacks don't work very well. So in addition to those airstrikes, the United States began using napalm, which spewed burning jellied gasoline, and Agent Orange, a chemical used to defoliate the lush Vietnamese countryside. Because it is rural, because it is a farming country, we're going to take out all of their crops. The use of these weapons increased the resentment of South Vietnamese peasants and added the Viet Cong recruitment efforts. Even with the massive increase of American ground forces, the United States struggled to effectively combat the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics. American troops became increasingly frustrated fighting an enemy they could not see. Some troops took to indiscriminately burning down villages and killing non-combatant civilians that were unarmed, who were not trying to fight off the American troops, who were not trying to hurt the American troops. They end up burning their villages and killing them. And we have lots of proof of this, but one that was made true and showed the consolidation of the American troops' frustration and racism is what happened at My Lai. In March of 1968, an American platoon murdered between 350 to 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mostly women and older men and children in the village. The Johnson administration's escalation of the war appeared to be making no tangible gains in Vietnam, and popular opinion, especially after the My Lai massacre, began turning against the war, and also after the Tet Offensive. This next picture is pretty gruesome. This shows the bodies that were killed. It shows the bodies of the dead at My Lai. You'll notice there are children, there are babies here. Most of these are women and children that we see in this picture that were murdered. Again, non-combatant, not fighting against the men that were coming into the village, not trying to stop them. They went up, lined them up, and shot them all. American soldiers did that. So you can see why a lot of people are against the war, because so many innocent people are dying. And in January of 1968, Communist forces launched a massive coordinated surprise offensive throughout major population centers in South Vietnam. And while U.S. troops were able to defeat the Tet Offensive, the battle proved to be extremely costly for the United States. The scale and the level of the Tet Offensive led many Americans to question our involvement in Vietnam. And in the face of public doubt and criticism of his policies in Vietnam, he ceased the bombing campaign and called for peace negotiations instead. Shortly thereafter, Johnson had shocked the nation by announcing that he would not be seeking re-election. By the time Johnson left office, peace negotiations had stalled, and more than 36,000 Americans and 52,000 South Vietnamese troops had died in combat. And this is the Tet Offensive. So basically what they do is they go in and they attack all these cities, most of them on the same night at the same time. It's a coordinated attack. And part of the challenges that we're going to see to the liberal establishment and also to what's going on in Vietnam, we're going to kind of look at both sides of that. So the New Left, this is inspired by the Civil Rights Movement, a generation of young activists, and they're embracing ideas about freedom, equality, and community, and protests against war, poverty, racism, the corporatization of society, sexism, and environmental devastation. In 1961, a graduate student named Tom Hayden used the SNCC as a model in forming an organization called Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, which drew its membership mainly from heavily white college campuses. SDS was the foundation for the New Left, a movement that criticized the Cold War, mainstream liberalism. They criticized racism and inadequate college education for undergraduates, and they called for a democracy in which everyone could participate. Other organizations and movement cropped up alongside them, including the Free Speech Movement, which was established at the University of California at Berkeley to protest the repression of civil rights activism on campus. The Free Speech Movement united Berkeley students and faculty in protest when California Governor Brown sent in the police to evict the demonstrators, and over the next few years, the Free Speech Movement spread across the nation. Restrictions on free speech were not all that riled the resentment and frustration of young people across the nation. As the Vietnam War escalated, students in particular began to fear and fight the draft. In 1966, with 250,000 troops surge on the horizon, students engaged in a wave of protest. Though college protests and draft dodging attracted significant attention, only about 1/5 of all college students participated in those. Protests intensified over the course of 1967, with anti-war sentiment spreading beyond college students to include professionals, politicians, and artists. By 1968, the SDS had split into factions, with the most radical branch, the Weathermen, using violence to make its point. The New Left spurred the rise of a counterculture in which people rejected traditional values, sexual restraint, and the complacency of middle class, and emphasized instant gratification, embracing the moment, and using drugs. Members of the counterculture, also known as hippies, proclaimed their lack of respect for their elders in slogans such as "Don't trust anyone over 30," and expressed concerns about bureaucracy, modern technology, and nuclear annihilation. The counterculture celebrated rock and roll music's ability to intersect popular sound with social and political ideas, characterized by "The Times They Are A-Changin'," a song by Bob Dylan. The Beatles, a British rock band, transitioned from writing songs about love to writing songs about politics and embraced a psychedelic style. Other popular bands that embraced a similar aesthetic included the Rolling Stones, The Who, The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and The Doors. In addition, soul music gained increasing popularity in the 1960s, with Motown Records emerging in Detroit, Michigan, and Stax Records operating out of Memphis, Tennessee. The counterculture embraced a sexual revolution, celebrating deviation from traditional standards of monogamy, fidelity, and moderation by engaging in casual sex, extramarital sex, group sex, and public nudity. Countercultural sexual mores were present in popular culture, with the Broadway musical Hair featuring frontal nudity, and the movie industry making risque films more widely available by labeling them with R and X ratings. For women, changing standards in sexual culture led them to a new pursuit of sexual pleasure and freedom that was made possible by the availability of birth control. So the culture of civil rights, social consciousness, and sexual freedom fostered a resurgence of the women's movement, which highlighted the fact that women had unequal access to employment and education and lacked political power and control over their own reproduction. This is still true in 2022. By 1960, women made up about one-third of the labor force and 35% of college enrollments, and they participated widely in the 1960 social movements, which provided them with the foundation for fueling further protests. Guys, I said that this is still true in 2022, and I mean, we still don't have equal access to employment. We still don't have equal access to education. There is still not an equal rights amendment that was, it didn't pass. We women are still discriminated against, and legally we can be. In 1961, Kennedy created the Commission on the Status of Women, and in 1963, the Commission issued American Women, a report that cited workplace inequality and prompted passage of the Equal Pay Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned sexual bias in employment and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. However, women were split over the Equal Rights Amendment, first proposed by Alice Paul in 1923. The 1963 publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave the women's movement further momentum by raising questions about the ways in which society dictated gender roles. The book highlighted the frustration, loneliness, and isolation that women she had studied had experienced, but it failed to connect with the experiences of working class immigrant African American women who did not have the option of staying home and getting bored. In October 1966, Friedan and her associates established the National Organization for Women, called NOW, which prompted sexual equality, passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, maternity leave, the establishment of child care centers, and reproductive rights. NOW was predominantly a white, middle-class organization, as African American women, for instance, tended to focus on civil rights over women's liberation. But NOW's membership nonetheless grew from about 1,000 in 1966 to 15,000 in 1971. Though women were central to the social movements of the 1960s, they routinely encountered discrimination in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. Women responded to this discrimination by forming separate organizations that used radical tactics to critique patriarchy and traditional gender roles, picketing the Miss America pageant, publicly discarding makeup and undergarments, and forming separate women's collectives. Among the most significant victories of the women's liberation movement was the 1973 Supreme Court ruling in Roe v. Wade, which outlawed state restrictions on abortion during the first trimester and declared that abortion was and should be a private medical issue. The Roe v. Wade decision was celebrated in some circles. People who viewed abortion as the murder of a human child rallied against the ruling, triggering a cultural battleground that has continued relevance even today. Other groups embraced militancy as well, with impoverished workers criticizing Johnson's lackluster commitment to the war on poverty in the face of mounting struggle in Vietnam. For Latinos, the majority of whom were now in the United States in the 1960s, discrimination was a persistent problem. Cesar Chavez embraced Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence in leading an effort to improve conditions for Mexican farm workers. Chavez established the National Farm Workers Association in 1962, and then 3 years later, the union launched a strike against California grape growers that would last for 5 years. Younger Mexican Americans formed the Brown Berets, an organization that, a lot like the Black Panther Party, advocated self-defense and rejected assimilation. In 1969, some 1,500 Mexican-American activists met in Denver, Colorado, where they adopted the term Chicano to convey their cultural pride and identity and created a new political organization. This new political organization was called La Raza Unida, and they advocated for bilingual education, job creation, the establishment of Chicano study programs in colleges, and they supported the expansion of the Voting Rights Act to cover areas of the country in which the Hispanic population had poor English skills and voter registration was low. Puerto Ricans also organized a group to promote and protect their communities called the Young Lords Party, which originated in Chicago and soon spread to New York City. They established inner-city breakfast programs and medical clinics while supporting bilingual education in public schools and advocating for Puerto Rico's independence. American Indians embraced a surge of activism as well and sought to improve their desperate conditions through organizations like the American Indian Movement, also called AIM, which was established in 1968 to combat poverty, alcoholism, unemployment, the low life expectancy, and lack of education within the American Indian community. In 1969, AIM members occupied Alcatraz Penitentiary, an abandoned prison island in San Francisco Bay, and in 1972 they moved into the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters in Washington, D.C. to push for reparations for treaty violations and the abolition of the Bureau. You guys should watch Drunk History. Do Drunk History, Indian Takeover of Alcatraz. If you just type that in YouTube, it should come up. It's really funny. So AIM members also holed up in the village of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, holding 11 hostages for 70 days to call attention to poor living conditions on the reservation. The occupation ended in a violent confrontation in which one protester was killed and another wounded. Asian American college students on the West Coast formed their own liberation movements, also often partnering with Black students to work for increased equality and visibility of their history. At San Francisco State, Asian American student workers with the Black Student Union and established programs in Asian and Black studies after going on strike for 5 months. And at this time, many Japanese American high school and college students were learning about their parents' and grandparents' internment for the very first time. The activism of this generation helped convince the moderate Japanese American Citizens League to endorse reparations for internees. This 2-decade campaign would eventually be successful in the 1990s. The gay liberation movement also drew on the civil rights movement as homosexuals began to break away from their secretive existence during the 1950s. Police in New York City had regularly raided the Stonewall Tavern, a popular gay establishment. But on June 27th of 1969, the bar's patrons fought back, triggering a new movement that expressed gay pride and demanded equal treatment regardless of your sexual orientation. This is just showing they're about to take over Alcatraz Island and showing them on the boat going. You can tell they're in it for the long haul. They've got blankets, they've got their mugs, they're ready to go. So this is when you have to watch the Drunk History one. This is when they try to buy it back for like 20 glass beads or something, the equivalency that the Dutch paid Native Americans for the island of Manhattan. Long petty game. So the rise of conservatism. So this is kind of in response to this liberal establishment that's been happening. So liberalism, it seemed vibrant in the 1960s, but while social movements further led to the left had significant momentum, they were not unchallenged, and conservatives drew increasing support. 1960s conservatism that fused libertarianism, laissez-faire economics, religious devotion, family values, in opposition to communism and social welfare. The new generation of conservatives believed that the United States must play a central role in fighting communism around the world, and they rejected the influence of the United Nations. Individuals and organizations, such as William F. Buckley in the National Review, the Reverend Billy Joe Hargis and his Christian Crusade, and Dr. Schwartz and his Christian Anti-Communism Crusade, and the John Birch Society, crystallized conservative philosophy and disseminated it through radio broadcast and written works. The new conservatism bubbled up from Sunbelt suburbs, and women were central to the movement, advocating abstinence, education, religion in public schools, and patriotism. College students joined the right-wing revival, and in 1960, a group of 90 young students who had gathered in Sharon, Connecticut, drafted a statement that articulated new conservative beliefs and formed the Young Americans for Freedom, an organization that had spread to 100 college campuses within 6 months. In politics, Barry Goldwater, who was running against Johnson in '64, he captured the attention of young conservatives, and in his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, he argued that the United States should abolish Social Security, do away with the Tennessee Valley Authority, and get rid of the progressive income tax. Goldwater also opposed the Brown v. Board of Education decision and Civil Rights Act of 1964, giving him clout among white Southerners, but he also advocated for increased military spending alongside critiques of big government. Though he was popular with conservatives, his policies were too far to the right for voters in 1964. George Wallace also became a presence on the national political scene during the '64 presidential campaign, capturing the attention of white Southerners opposed to civil rights and white Northerners who were frustrated and anxious about Black militancy, school busing, and efforts to end residential segregation. Wallace won a significant portion of the vote in the Democratic primaries in Indiana, Wisconsin, and Maryland. Although Goldwater ran a campaign that won wider support, Wallace's politics rallied working-class Americans who approved of his attacks on college students and liberal elites, and his dismissal of racial extremists and the counterculture. And what we're going to talk about in the next chapter, we're going to look at the rise of conservatism and kind of more about this part of it that's going on in the 60s and the 70s. So stay tuned for that.